Drive Home Reviews meets Abbott and Costello, and I think we can finally say that we have arrived. I feel like the signs are there, and we can now definitively say we have reached the latter third of Abbott and Costello's film career. We're entering into kind of the last chapter, as you will. There are some telltale signs that you can point to recognize when you're in latter days Abbott and Costello territory, one of which is the appearance of Bud's mustache. You know, once Bud grows the mustache, that's usually an indication that we're in late stages Abbott and Costello. However, his mustache is still 2 films off, I believe. But what really kind of, for me, is the signpost that says this is kind of the start of that final chapter, is we've entered into what I like to refer to as the Abbott and Costello Meets portion of their career. And what I mean by that is, of the 12 films that we still have to look at, including this one, 8 of those movies, their titles are some variation on Abbott and Costello Meet, Go To, or In. 8 out of 12. That's 66%, I think. I actually did the math on this. I hope I did it right. Please don't tell me if I didn't. That's still a lot. What's funny to me about this is one of the things we talked about a lot when we were looking at the early days of their film careers is that the storylines and the plots for those movies really were just variations on Abbott and Costello go to a place and do a thing. You know, Abbott and Costello join the Army, join the Navy, join the Air Force, investigate a murder, go skiing, go to a dude ranch. You know, the stories were just designed to get them from one bit of comic business to the next with a very thin plot to kind of string everything together. Very, very vaudeville. Whereas now, through the middle and latter half of their careers, they have really been trying to put an emphasis on stories that have a plot structure and comedy that comes out of the story as opposed to just pre-planned routines all the time. And yet it is the later films that have kind of the more generic titles, you know, Abbott and Costello Go, Do, or In, you know? And you can't blame anybody for that, really, because it makes sense from a marketing standpoint. Going off the success of Meets Frankenstein, Mexican Hayride, Africa Screams, and then this film, Abbott and Costello were still the 3rd highest box office draws in the country, second only to Bob Hope and Bing Crosby. Think about that. That's almost a decade of making movies and over 20 films together, and they are still the 3rd highest box office draw. So you cannot blame the movie studio for wanting to, you know, turn into the skid a bit and advertise to people, especially as the boys are getting older. Their films have been around for a lot longer. You want to tell people, hey, you know those guys whose, you know, comedy you love and movies you enjoy? Well, here's another one, and they're going to do this wacky thing. You know, it just makes sense. But we are going to see, as we kind of get further into this era, that they really do kind of rest on that name recognition and that brand recognition to kind of push them along. We're not quite there yet. We still have some strong films before we get there. And one of those strong films being this one. So let's take a look at the official, as far as I'm concerned, the official start of the last chapter of Abbott and Costello's film career with Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer, Boris Karloff. We're going to talk about that rather clunky title here in just a second. All right, so before we start talking about the ins and outs of this movie, let's talk about the story. So what's going on here? Well, our story takes place at a spooky hotel called the Lost Caverns Hotel, where a famous criminal lawyer has arrived. And no sooner has he arrived than he is found murdered in his hotel room. And the prime suspect is the little bellhop, Freddie Phillips, played by Lou Costello, whom the lawyer had gotten fired earlier in the evening. So Lou is now the prime suspect, and it is up to him and Bud, who is playing the hotel detective, to figure out who the real killer is to clear Lou's name. The list of suspects is long and interesting, but of course the most interesting is the titular character of Boris Karloff, who plays some kind of swami who has the power to hypnotize people. So there is the basic story. Lou is framed for murder, and he and Bud have to try to figure out who the real killer is. So right away, we see that Bud and Lou have entered a genre they haven't really touched much in the last couple years, which is kind of surprising, given the success of things like Whodunit, Hold That Ghost, Meets Frankenstein, and, you know, the always reliable laughs of Lou Costello when he's scared. It's kind of funny that they have not done a lot of pure detective films. I mean, the last one you could say they did was really Whodunit, way back in the day. And of the two, between this one and Whodunit, I have to say, I think this one is the superior detective Whodunit film. Now, again, I'm not taking anything away from Whodunit. I love Whodunit. I think it's hilarious. But it is a product of early stages Abbott and Costello. As we mentioned, Abbott and Costello have a thin story to kind of link them to one comedy routine or another, but they have no real impact on the telling of the story. So in Whodunit, while a great picture, they really don't do anything to solve the murder. They leave that to generic boy and girl number 4 to take care of that for them, so they have time to run around and do the Alexander 2222 business. Now in this film, with Lou being the prime suspect, and everything in the film is revolved around the killer trying to frame Lou, and Lou and Bud trying to prove his innocence, now they are at the center point of the story, and everything revolves around them. So all of the comedy comes out of them trying to solve the murder or trying to throw suspicion off of Lou, as clues and other dead bodies repeatedly show up in his room and whatnot. So the comedy is much more tied to the situation. So again, I think out of the two, this one is by far the better picture, in my opinion. I'm also going to say, and I hadn't really thought about it until I watched this and did a little bit of research in preparation for this discussion, but it is true that this is one of the darker Abbott and Costello films. Abbott and Costello could never be said to have been, dark humor. That just wasn't their thing, and it wasn't even a big thing back then. Black comedy was not a huge genre. You had them, of course, but they were not, I don't even think they had the term for it back then. But of their films, this one definitely, in terms of tone and atmosphere, it is definitely a lot darker, even compared to something like Hold That Ghost or Meets Frankenstein. Hold That Ghost was spooky, but it was traditional comedy haunted house kind of vibes. It was spooky, but it wasn't dark. It was Scooby-Doo, essentially, as we've talked about. Meets Frankenstein was macabre, and it had atmosphere to spare, but most of that was in the grandeur of it. The larger sets, the bigger name co-stars. There was a grandeur to the spooky atmosphere. But this one is, in terms of tone and even lighting, there's a lot more shadows being played. There are a lot more black costumes going on. This one is a little bit more reminiscent of a film noir. It's obviously not, but it has those earmarks. And also just in terms of what's going on in it. Now, murder, of course, has been the subject of comedy for a long time. But this one goes a little bit above and beyond kind of what they did in Whodunit. Probably one of the highlights of this movie for me is an extended scene about the middle of it when Lou and Bud come back to Lou's room and they find 2 more dead bodies in it. Someone has killed these 2 other characters and dropped them in Lou's room to further implicate him. And so now Lou, dressed in drag as a chambermaid, and Bud are now trying to smuggle the dead bodies out of his room and drop them off somewhere so he won't get in further and further trouble. And of course, the bodies keep coming back and they keep having to go back out. It's a whole thing. There's another section towards the end of the film where somebody is moving the dead body all around in Lou's room. So there is a lot of playing with corpses in this movie, which again, comparatively to what we have today, that's not incredibly dark. But for the time, 1948, that was pretty macabre. And in fact, the censors were not happy. Believe it or not, this movie was banned in Denmark because of that. So an Abbott and Costello movie was in fact banned in Denmark. I just find that really, really funny. So let's talk about the titular co-star. Let's talk about Mr. Boris Karloff finally doing a film with Bud and Lou. As you may recall, they had offered him the chance to reprise his role as the Frankenstein monster for Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein, but he turned it down for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was the feeling that they were going to make a mockery out of it. Now, when he saw that they didn't, he was much more applicable to joining them in a film and actually was looking forward to it. So he actually does 2 movies with them, this being the first. And despite what the title would have you believe, he does not play a very big part in this film. He's one of the other suspects, notable only because he's the most famous of them and the most obscure, playing a Swami. There is a decent bit in this film where, in an attempt to implicate Costello, the group of suspects, all of whom are former clients of the lawyer who was murdered, are plotting to kill Lou and leave a fake confession by him, therefore to throw suspicion off of them. And the fake Swami, played by Boris Karloff, a fake Swami who still has the power to hypnotize people, goes to Lou's room and tries to hypnotize him into committing suicide. So there again, pretty dark subject matter, suicide in an Abbott and Costello comedy. So, again, it's a decent bit. It's funny, and Boris Karloff is a great contrast to Lou. But he really doesn't interact with them that much, for being the person they supposedly meet in this film. Yes, they do in fact meet him, but there's not a lot of interaction. But it's still good to see him. He's a Hollywood legend. He's a horror movie legend. And having that crossover, again, gives them the boost they've always said they need to give us a good co-star and we can do some magical things. And once again, they're proven right. Another co-star of this one who deserves some mention, and I didn't talk about her in the Meets Frankenstein review because there's just so much to talk about there, is Lenore Albert, who plays one of the other suspects in this film, another femme fatale who tries to seduce Lou in a very, very funny scene. Matter of fact, I think her scene with him is better than his scene with Karloff, if I'm being honest. Of course, she played Sandra, Lou's girlfriend and the mad scientist who was plotting to take his brain out in Meets Frankenstein. And Bud and Lou loved her. They loved working with her. Lou was very happy to get her on this film, and in fact, he wanted to keep using her. Like, he wanted her for their next film because he really liked working with her, thought that the dynamic between them worked very well, especially with her being very tall, having a foreign accent, so there's an exotic nature about her, and she worked very well with his timing. So he actually wanted to keep using her kind of in the same way Groucho Marx used Margaret Dumont, and the studio nixed that, saying they didn't want to make this into a trio, But she's back, and again, a wonderful job. not a whole lot of films to her credit, to be completely honest. I was kind of surprised by that. But she has these two classic turns with Lou Costello, and I think that's pretty good. The rest of the cast is nondescript and easily forgettable. I said this was a better detective film than Whodunit. It's still not a great detective film. If you're looking for a pure detective film, a whodunit, a real whodunit, it's better. There's more structure to it, but the list of suspects are not very well developed. You can't really, none of them aside from Lenore and Karloff get any kind of backstory to who they are. So therefore, they're not really great as other suspects. And when it is finally revealed the plot that led to the murder, it's very Agatha Christie. It's very much things that there is no way you could have figured out on your own. That's not a knock against this film. I want to stress that. It's a knock against it if you are trying to see a full Thin Man style murder mystery where the fun is you trying to figure out who did it. And that's not the point here. This is Lou being scared by dead bodies and Lou trying to hide dead bodies. That's the comedy. So it's not a knock against the film. It's just a statement that for a detective film, for a mystery, the mystery is still kind of taking the back seat. Again, not a problem. That does not impede my enjoyment of this film anymore. And I love this movie. This is one of my favorite Abbott and Costello films. It is just like my bread and butter. Combines things that I just love. Of course, Abbott and Costello, naturally, includes old school detective cliches and archetypes. I love old school detectives. Love them to death. And I especially love the location, a spooky hotel. Like, that's just great. So I truly love this film. Yes, there are some minor flaws in it, but nothing insurmountable. It's still a really fun watch. The bit towards the end when Lou is in the supposed hidden caverns that the hotel is named after and the killer is there chasing him around, that goes on a little too long in my estimation. I think they could have shortened that a bit. But it's still a fun little jaunt. However, I do want to talk a little bit before we sign up about this title, this very misleading title of Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer, Boris Karloff, because, spoiler alert for a movie over 60 years old, Boris Karloff is not, in fact, the killer. He is not, in fact, the one who committed the murder, because that's the definition of killer. Why I felt I had to spell that out to you, I don't know. But anyway, so let's talk about this title, because there's kind of an interesting twists and turns why they named it this. The first is obvious, trying to capitalize on the success of Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein. As mentioned, the one that got away from that film was Boris Karloff. So now, trying to draw on that success, they are trying to tell the audience right away, come see them interact with the one guy they didn't interact with in Meet Frankenstein, that I'm sure fans of the time were even very much aware of. So in one case, it was a means of trying to get the fans hooked and interested. But the other was legal, because the original title of this film was Abbott and Costello Meet the Killers, meaning the entire group of suspects that are there. Again, that's the definition of killers. I don't know why I'm spelling these things out for you people all of a sudden. Sorry about that. But there was another film being released called The Killers, and they feared legal problems or confusion with that movie. So instead, they decided to play off of the star power of Boris Karloff and simply rename it Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer, Boris Karloff. I've seen other iterations of the film where they just call it Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer. So, but I do believe it's always been Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer, Boris Karloff, in my estimation. So regardless of some minor flaws in it, it is still a really fun movie. It's a good use of Bud and Lou. They're playing interesting characters. They have a great dynamic, as always. They're not leaning on their standby routines. The comedy's coming out of the situation. And, again, riding that high off Meets Frankenstein. So I highly recommend this one. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. So that's it for this incarnation of Drive Home Reviews Meets Abbott and Costello. However, we will return very soon as, once again, Abbott and Costello return to the armed forces. However, this time, as opposed to going back to the Army, Navy, or the Flying Corps, they are going all the way to the Foreign Legion. So please come back and join us with Abbott and Costello in the Foreign Legion. Thank you very much for coming along with us, and as always, drive safe, and I will see you at the movies.